Much, Anne-Sophie, both for that introduction, both to me and to this conference. And thank you too for your leadership and initiative in convening this event. I'm grateful as well for the generous support of the NS and the InSpectA project. It is such a delight to be able to discuss dance, drama, and cognition with all of you today. I apologize for speaking in English. You would not want to hear my attempts to speak in French. But I look forward to hearing from all of you and discussing all of this further. So I'm going to use PowerPoint to display my primary texts and key references. There is a handout as well, which Anne-Sophie circulated, but that has all of the same material, just some additional bibliographic references. So you could refer to either, whichever you prefer. So my goal today is to discuss the second stasimon of Euripides' play Iphigenia among the Taurians. The chorus of this play is made up of Greek maidens in service to Iphigenia, whom Artemis, the goddess, has transported to the land of the Taurians, near the Black Sea, to serve as a priestess. In this version of the myth, of course, Iphigenia was not sacrificed to Artemis at Aulis, but instead saved by the goddess and brought to a foreign land. The chorus members represent themselves in their parados or entrance song as having likewise left behind their ancestral Greek home, Hellas. They are therefore closely identified with Iphigenia herself, maidens mindful of their Hellenic origins, strangers among the Taurians, longing for the homes that they have left behind. In the second stasimon, the chorus describes its seemingly impossible desires in particular detail, singing of how it is longing for the gathering places of the Hellenes, longing for Artemis Lochia, the goddess of childbirth. It also, over the course of its ode, deploys a dazzling series of images closely associated with choral dancing: birds, trees, celestial bodies, and ships. Many scholars have discussed how this ode engages with the vivid choral imagination evident across in the way that the dancing of the chorus in the original production of the play might have interacted with the images of music and dance generated by the lyrics of the ode. So today, I'm specifically interested in using this ode as a case study for exploring how desire, memory, and dance work together in Greek tragedy. To that end, I want to begin by speaking briefly about some models of kinesthetic empathy and chorality in ancient Greek thought. I would then like to note how the particular mimetic demands of tragedy might complicate these models, or at least put more pressure upon them. Returning at that point to Iphigenia among the Taurians, I aim to consider how this ode uses the imagery of dance and desire to structure its audience's response. So let me begin then by addressing some broader questions surrounding the conceptualization of empathy, memory, and desire in Greek choral song. And I'll be drawing extensively here from the work that I've provided in the bibliography. The Homeric hymn to Apollo is a frequent touchstone for the conceptualization of embodied empathy and identification in Greek song. In this passage, the poet describes how the people gathered on the island of Delos worship Apollo. Although they are themselves diverse in origin and identity, they share a common wonder at the song dance of the Delian maidens. When these superlative performers sing and dance, each spectator feels as if he himself is participating. As I have argued elsewhere, this experience is grounded in memory or familiarity. It is linked with the maiden's ability to perform the songs and dances of all peoples. In this respect, the imagery of this hymn finds a complement in a passage from Plato's Laws, in which the Athenian stranger declares that the old men take delight in watching younger men perform chorea, or choral song dance, because although their own nimbleness has left them, they can be stirred up again by watching younger men perform. Plato's emphasis on memory, mneme, as the mechanism of this process corresponds well with his conservative views on performance in general. He argues in part that the practices of choral song dance should remain stable over time. And thus enjoy the performances of the young. Both I and Lucy Jackson have described this process as one of kinesthetic empathy, of a deeply felt sense of identification between performer and spectator, whereby specific forms of social and civic cohesion may be advanced. Yet in my own work on this phenomenon thus far, I want to acknowledge that I've been less attentive to the role of desire, the experience of longing, wanting, and erotic attraction expressed by Greek terms like eros and pathos. So for example, note that Plato's old men are not only stirred up, epegarein, by watching the performance, they also come to it pothuntes, for their former agility. Leslie Kirk has argued that in Plato's laws, as well as earlier Greek poetry, eros, desire or attraction, is the motor for the powerful conjuring of presence through chorality. While she perceives important distinctions between Plato's somewhat idiosyncratic model and the kinds of attraction contributed to chorea, should we do any, is it dinging because people are trying to get in or no?
Yes, there should be something to, pour enlever la sonnerie. If you don't mind.
Just let it go, yeah, we'll just leave it, sounds good. Sorry. Thank you, Anne-Sophie. That eros, right, desire or attraction, can function as a motor for the conjuring of presence through chorality. And I'd like to pick up on that idea of desire as a motor, as a force that sets in motion the particular effects and experiences bound up with choral dancing in the Greek cultural imagination. In thinking along these lines, I am also indebted to the work of Michel Briand, who demonstrates how Sappho's songs exploit the affective and sensorial nexus of desire, pleasure, movement, and sound. Discussing a set of poems with explicitly erotic interests, he observes how they share an understanding of eros, and here I translate, as an irresistible force of transport, repeated or persistent, with powerful physical, moral, and social effects, associated with a polyvalent and dynamic conception of beauty. While obviously specific in some regards to Sappho, I think his account expands and intensifies Kirk's notion of eros as motor in a helpful way. I'd like to propose that we attend to the role of desire in poetic accounts of choral empathy and identification, with a particular view to understanding how both the allure of the performer and the longing of the spectator contribute to the special alchemy of chorea. So with that in mind, let's return to the Homeric hymn to Apollo. As I suggested before, the audience's sense of wonder at this performance relies on a form of immersive identification, even kinesthetic empathy. The spectator feels as if he is singing along with the maidens. Yet the Delian maidens are also distinctively alluring. Their song is kale, beautiful, and they enchant, thelgusi, those who hear them. As Natasha Peponi observes, the latter description likens these maidens to the sirens of the Odyssey, dangerously attractive figures of musical performance. So what if we conceptually pry apart these two elements? That is, superlative forms of choral song dance in early Greek thought invite their audiences to identify with the performers and also to feel desire for them. These two experiences need not be directly opposed, but nor are they precisely the same. And I think attending more closely to desire along with memory and empathy can help us to better understand how tragic chorality engages its viewers. At this juncture, let me once more step back and clarify my earlier comments about the mimetic complexity of tragedy. I do not mean to imply that non-dramatic choral lyric was invariably straightforward in its techniques of representation. To the contrary, many have discussed how the songs of Pindar, Sappho, Elkman, and Timotheus, to name just a few, invite their audiences into rich and varied imaginative song worlds. But dramatic mimesis, as practiced in classical Athens, does have some distinctive features. And for the purposes of my discussion today, the misalignment of the identity of the choral performers themselves and the identities that they represent on stage is particularly important. Greek tragedy, of course, was performed by male citizens, who frequently represented female mythic characters in choruses. This is the case for Iphigenia among the Taurians. The isolated, mournful maidens of the chorus were originally enacted by adult men. As others have discussed, Greek drama thus demanded serious cognitive work from its audience. We possess the language of these plays. We generally lack their choreography, music, and set design. Yet all of these elements would have worked together to enable the audience to see the men on stage in the Theater of Dionysus in Athens sometime in the late spring, as, for example, Phoenician women stranded in Thebes, or satyrs frolicking on the island of the Cyclopes. In the case of Iphigenia among the Taurians, the play opens with a prologue spoken by Iphigenia herself, which locates the audience in mythic time and space and assists them in identifying the various actors in the drama. But how did the audience come to feel invested in the action? That is not, of course, a question we can answer in strictly positivist terms. Any investigation at one of the choral odes in Iphigenia among the Taurians, I propose to highlight some ways in which the song and dance of the chorus might have worked to engage the audience in the mimetic fiction of the play. So as I've already mentioned, in its second stasimon, the chorus longs for home, for Greece. After describing the lamentation of the bird, it sings, I, a bird with no wings, vie with you in lamentation, longing for the Greeks' gathering, longing for Artemis, goddess of childbed, who dwells by the Cynthian hill, and the date palm with its tender tresses, and the lovely slip of laurel, and the sacred shoot of the green olive, dear to Leto's offspring, and the lake that swirls its water in a circle, where the melodious swan renders his service to the muses. While this chorus is vague about its own origins, never mentioning a specific city or region, its memories here are clearly linked with the island of Delos. It longs, Puthusa, to return to the sanctuary of Artemis Lochia, and it envisions topographic features specifically associated with the island, the palm tree, Mount Kinthos, and the sacred lake. When it describes the lake as swirling, Helisusan, it applies choreographic language to physical space. Glysso, to whirl or spin, is a verb associated with choral dancing elsewhere in Euripidean lyric. The lake is thus assimilated to the performers and the performances that occur alongside or near it. In this way, the chorus underscores the connections between Delos and dance, and links memories of its landscape with the recollection of performance events. How might the chorus's memories interact with the memories of the audience members? I'd like to focus for now on the notional audience of the play as composed of male Athenian citizens, although we might further discuss the possible inclusion of other spectators at various points. In the late 5th century, Delos was a flourishing cult site and one of particular political and strategic importance to the Athenians. It is entirely possible, even likely, that many of the audience members would have their own memories of traveling, worshiping, and watching ritual song dance on the island of Delos. In addition, Tim Power and Felix Budelman demonstrate that, while the public performance of chorea by girls and women was limited and ideologically marginalized in classical Athens, it is likely that Athenians, especially aristocratic elites, encountered such maidenly chorality at sanctuaries and festivals beyond Athens proper. In other words, at sites like Delos. Through its allusions to Delian festivity, then, the chorus invites the audience to share its longings. By referring to specific and potentially familiar ritual sites and scenarios, it prompts the viewers to engage in their own nostalgic recollection of festive spectatorship and performance. If the audience accepts this invitation, its emotional experience becomes aligned with that of the maidens stranded among the Taurians. Chorus and audience alike recall and long for the performances and ritual sites of their own past. the audience in Athens, and the dancers imaginatively on the shores of the Black Sea, both looking back and feeling desire for Delos and its distinctive ritual and performative landscape. Yet while the first strophe thus creates common ground for the audience and the chorus, the corresponding antistrophe stresses the distinctive identity of the choruts. They now sing, "Ah, how many are the teardrops that fell upon my cheeks. When my city's walls destroyed, I was brought on a ship by the oars and spears of the enemy. For much money, I reached my barbarian home, where I attend the maiden daughter of Agamemnon, who serves the hind-slaying goddess, and attend the altars where no sheep are sacrificed." These lines remind the audience of the larger dramatic context and situate the chorus within it. The chorus members figure themselves as damsels in distress, Greek maidens captured in war, and now forced to live among enemies and barbarians. The reference to the altars where no sheep are sacrificed alludes to the Taurian practice of human sacrifice, a pointed contrast to the appealing and emphatically Greek ritual festivities on Delos, as described in the preceding stanza. The performers call attention to both their estrangement from their homes and the vulnerability of their bodies, the tears on their cheeks. Their self-depiction in these lines thus forms a sad echo of maidenly chorality. These young women are at the point in their lives when they ought to be most beautiful, poised on the cusp of marriage, dancing in choral community. Instead, they are violently separated from their Greek homelands and trapped in a violent foreign realm. This sense of loss and lamentation persists in the second strophe, as the chorus sings, "You, lady, shall be borne homeward on an Argive ship with 50 rowers, and the wax-bound reed pipe of Pan, the mountain god, will give the beat to the oars, while Phoebus the prophet, holding the loud-sounding 7-stringed lyre, sings and leads you in safety to the gleaming land of Athens. Me you shall leave here and fare over the waves, as in the breeze the sail yards spread out the sails against the forestay, over the bows and beyond the prow of the swift sailing ship." These lines allude to the development of the dramatic plot immediately prior to this ode. Orestes is promised to take Iphigenia home to Argos by way of Athens, since Apollo has ordered him to take a statue of Artemis from the Taurians and bring it to the city of Athena. Iphigenia begs the chorus to keep silent and promises to secure a future rescue for the chorus members themselves once she herself has arrived home. Whether the chorus trusts her assurances or not, here they sing a plaintive lament for all that they have lost and contrast the persistence of their own plight with Iphigenia's imminent departure. In these lines, Euripides also foreshadows the conclusion of the play, in which Athens and Attic ritual sites will come to play an even larger role. But for now, the allusion to Athens as a site of sanctuary and safe return can also be heard as an appeal to the civic pride of the audience. Athens, Argos, and Delos all stand in stark contrast to the world of the Taurians. Home, Hellenism, and normative ritual performance versus alterity, barbarity, and horrifying religious practices. But by alluding specifically to Athens and figuring it as a gleaming land, a beacon of safety, the chorus reminds the audience of its own city, its own identity. I'd like to suggest that in the first antistrophe and second strophe of its song, that is its first 2 stanzas, the chorus's language once again, or the second 2 stanzas, the chorus's language once again works to awaken desire in the audience, albeit now desire for the pitiful choruts themselves and their miserable plight. By calling attention to the tears falling upon their cheeks, the chorus members remind us of the maidenly embodiment they seek to represent. By figuring themselves as vulnerable and isolated, physically and emotionally distant from Greece and Athens, they emphasize their dramatic identities rather than their actual ones. For these performers, after all, are Athenian men dancing and singing in Athens. But as they insist through the imagery of these lines, for the duration of the play, the audience is invited to instead see them, to imagine them, as attractive, vulnerable, vaguely Greek, and ideally marriageable maidens, young women pleading for rescue from the violent Taurians. Over the course of its ode thus far, the chorus takes aim at the two experiences of choral spectatorship that I described at the outset. On the one hand, its description of Delian festivity invites the audience to identify with the chorus, to share in its nostalgic memories. On the other hand, by stressing their dramatic identities as damsels in distress, young women at a vulnerable and highly eroticized moment in their lives, the choreutes also encourage the audience to feel desire for them. The former experience, that of imaginative recollection and identification, integrates nicely with the larger festival context of the play. Sitting on the slopes of the Acropolis, celebrating a festival for Dionysus, the audience is invited to assimilate their present experience of performance and spectatorship to past ritual experiences. Desire for the chorus, however, which relies on the performed identity of the choreutes and the mimetic fiction of the play, pulls the audience in a different direction, one which invites them to attend not to the ritual experience in which they are presently participating, but the imaginary world of the drama. My goal today is not to privilege one of these models of audience response over the other, but rather to explore how Euripides exploits them both. We can see, in fact, how they come together in the final stanza, the Second Antistrophy. Here, the chorus sings, "Would that I could tread the gleaming track where the sun goes with his lovely light. But above my own chamber, with the wings on my back would cease to beat. May I take my place in the choruses where once, as a maiden of illustrious family, near my dear mother I whirled and danced, and competing in grace with the throngs of my age mates, and vying with them in the luxury born of soft living wealth, I put on a veil of many hues and let down my tresses to shade my cheek." In these lines, the chorus once again invokes a rich array of orchestic or choral imagery. It turns to the movements of the heavens, figures itself as akin to a bird, and as we will see, gestures back to the arboreal imagery of the first stanza in a particularly interesting way. On one level, the chorus's depiction of itself in this final stanza intensifies its emphasis on the maidenly beauty of its members. In recalling their past dancing, the choreutes stress that they belong to illustrious families and used to inhabit a world of wealth and luxury. This recalls the imagery of the earlier description of tears falling. The audience is again invited to see these performers as both vulnerable and. Yet this final antistrophe also returns to the Delian imagery of the first strophe. The maidens recall how they whirled Hylissusa in the dance, echoing the whirling Hylissusan of the sacred lake on Delos. The alignment of the performers with the topography of the island sanctuary is also accomplished through a more subtle likening of the maidens themselves to trees. Deborah Steiner has noted this alignment and connected it with the choral imagery in Greek poetry and art more broadly, and I'd like to build here on her observations. In the first strophe, the Delian palm, Phoenica, is described as habrokomon, that is, defined by its luxurious or delicate habro, foliage, or locks, komon. The word kome can mean hair as well as foliage. In the chorus's concluding self-description, it is now the dancing maidens who possess richly luxuriant habroplutoio locks, kaitas. Like kome, kaite can mean both hair and foliage. The final antistrophe further describes the locks or braids, plocomus, of the maiden's hair that shades their cheeks, the hair that shades them like the leaves of a tree. In light of these links, the choreutes' description of the motion of their hair cast about in the dance could further evoke the movement of leaves and branches in the wind. The assimilation of the dancing maidens to the trees of Delos represents a fitting culmination of this ode's poetic fiction. In their dance, these choreotes embody both the youthful allure of the young woman in the chorus and also the ritual value and symbolic Hellenism of the sanctuary on Delos. By weaving together these two patterns of imagery, the chorus structures the audience's desire for itself and its song. I'd like to conclude, therefore, by proposing that the forms of longing, of pathos, strategically awakened by this ode, are programmatically expressed in the lines of the first strophe that I've used for my title today. Longing for the gathering places of the Greeks, longing for Artemis, the goddess of childbirth. Delos, of course, counts among the most significant and long-lasting gathering places of the Greeks, while Artemis, especially in her role as a deity of female maturation and transition, often represents the particular appeal of the young woman in the chorus. As the language and imagery of this ode invites the audience to share in the longings thus expressed, it also somewhat counterintuitively aligns them. To feel desire for this chorus is to be immersed in mimesis, in the process of seeing performing Athenian men as vulnerable and alluring Greek maidens. To share in a desire for Greek festivity is to remain aware, on some level, of the play itself as part of a ritual performance, to be able to see and feel its continuity with performances on Delos and other sacred sites. This choral ode, then, invites its audience to feel multiple forms of identification and desire without ever losing sight of its own mimetic fictions. While I've had time today to discuss only this single play and this single ode, I believe it is nonetheless emblematic of how Greek tragedy exploits the forms of recollection and longing evident in earlier choral lyric, and also adds further layers of representation and imagination. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sarah. Alors, comme tu es incroyablement ponctuelle, so you're very good with the time. La discussion aura lieu après la deuxième communication. Ce sera une discussion en commun, mais on a quand même peut-être le temps de prendre une ou deux petites questions avant de faire la pause. S'il y en a dans la salle ou à distance. Donc, nous avons le temps pour quelques questions si vous le souhaitez. Oui, Pauline.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This was really suggestive and super interesting. I have a comment.
Yes.
Question. The comment I'm sure has come to your mind. You ended. Thank you. You ended with a reference to the palm tree, and I'm sure one of the things that's behind all of that, and that has to do with this longing for Greek identity or this return to identity, is the famous Odyssey. Passage for this year's coming and saying to Nausicaa, oh, so much like I've never seen such a beauty, oh, except once when I saw the palm tree, etc. So this is maybe an opportunity for you to say a little bit more. The second thing that I want to, or rather the question has to do with age and levels of complications in what you describe in the relationship with the chorus, because of course, having a chorus of presumably young men depict young women facilitates the eroticism or the longing. Can you comment on cases where the chorus is a chorus? Obviously, it's not in the case of Iphigenia among the Taurians, but can you comment on other cases in Greek tragedy when the chorus is a chorus of old dudes that are less erotic than damsels in distress?
Yeah, let me start with that and then maybe go back to the other, because those were both, thank you so much, Pauline. Those are both great comments and questions and past things to think about. It's I think it's really interesting to think about choruses of old men, right? Because these are our predominant choruses, either young women or old men, and city elders. So thinking about something like, you know, Sophocles' Oedipus, right? City elders, or Agamemnon for Aeschylus. And those choruses, you know, I'm really interested in thinking more about how they invert this claim that Plato makes in the Laws that I brought up here, where there Plato's claim is that old men like to watch young men perform. But in those cases, what we're invited to imagine, it's actually young men performing, but they're performing old men. And so what kind of pleasure is supposed to be derived from that, right? Is it, in that case, is it that to watch that kind of chorus is to give yourself over completely to the fiction that these are old men? Or is there still some kind of longing that almost works in the reverse of what I've described here, where the object of desire is the imagined performer, not the real performer? Although, of course, it could also be, if these are young men dancing, they could also be erotically attractive. Is it the reverse, that they're supposed to be representing old men, but they are in fact young, right? So there's a desire, a kind of pathway of desire there for the performer that subverts in some way the mimetic fiction. So instead of, so that's kind of a first reaction to that. And I think that would be a really interesting about further. You're absolutely right that Nausicaa as palm tree in the Odyssey is lurking in the background here and is sort of part of the larger from which this comes. And one thing that I am fascinated by in that passage, which I do think is a model for this and is a kind of in the background, where Odysseus describes Nausicaa likewise as a dancer, taking her place in the chorus, as well as this sort of the superlative beauty of the palm tree. And it is all bound up in her being attractive at this moment on the cusp of marriage, this kind of marriageable maiden. Is the use of the present tense in that passage in the Odyssey, which I don't have, I'm sorry that I don't have the passage in front so I can highlight this, but I think there's something really interesting in that passage about the movement of the tree and the sort of growing and the ways that the tree is kind of in its present moment, both a kind of static or monumental image, right? Go back to the tree, you know, it's, that is an actual palm tree on Delos that I took a picture of once just for the purpose of PowerPoints, like a Delian palm. But also the movement of a tree and the ways that, and I think it's a powerful image for a maiden in a chorus who is both constrained and rooted in a certain identity, a moment in her life, but is moving, is dancing, is growing. And I think the Odyssey, through the use of present tense verbs, through the kinds of ways that Nausicaa is both being situated in this very particular life moment, but also as a kind of mobility, is super interesting. And I think some of that is at work in this passage as well. These maidens are both at this moment of precarity, but perhaps there's a moment of freedom in the dance as well, that a tree can somehow embody.
D'autres questions? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans le chat? Non, d'accord. Ok. Donc on fait une petite pause. 10 minutes. Merci beaucoup, Sarah.
Merci.
Thank you.